They called it a victory dinner. Bumpy Johnson's legal team celebrating a breakthrough in his case. Private room, expensive restaurant, champagne being poured. The lead attorney stood, raised his glass, made a toast to beating the system. Everyone drank. But Frank Lucas wasn't at that dinner. He was somewhere else entirely, staring at more money than he'd ever seen in his life, making a decision that would determine whether he lived as a king or died as a traitor. Harlem, November 1967. The temperature had dropped below freezing, but inside Bumpy Johnson's brownstone on 147th Street, the air felt like a furnace. Frank Lucas stood in the center of the room with his hands visible at his sides, breathing slowly, trying to keep his heart from exploding through his chest. Behind him stood Marcus Webb, Bumpy's chief enforcer, a man who'd earned his reputation through 30 years of violence so precise it had become an art form. Webb's .45 wasn't pointed at Frank's head. It didn't need to be. The implication was clear enough. Bumpy himself sat in a leather chair by the fireplace, watching Frank with the patient intensity of a man who'd spent 4 decades reading faces. Bumpy was 62 years old, his body slowly surrendering to the cancer that had been consuming him for 18 months. But his eyes were sharp as razors, and in this moment, those eyes held the power of life and death. "Tell me about the warehouse," Bumpy said. His voice was soft, conversational, a voice that had ordered executions and negotiated treaties with equal calm. Frank had rehearsed this moment, had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing exactly what he would say and how he would say it. But standing here now, with death waiting behind him, the rehearsed words evaporated. All that remained was truth. 3 nights ago, a man named Solomon approached me outside my building, said he had something to show me, something that would change my life. Bumpy nodded slowly. "Go on." "They drove me to Hunts Point, industrial area, abandoned warehouse. Inside there was a table, and on that table was more cash than I've ever seen. $10 million, stacked neat, counted in front of me." Webb shifted behind Frank. The sound of leather creaking, of weight redistributing. Frank forced himself not to react. 10 million, Bumpy repeated. "That's a serious number. What did Solomon want in exchange?" This was where it got dangerous. This was the admission that proved Frank had entertained the conversation instead of walking away immediately, that he'd listened to treason instead of reporting it. Everything. He wanted your entire operation. Supply routes, distribution networks, political connections, law enforcement protection, every business and property you own. He said, "When you're gone, the Italians are taking Harlem back." Said I could either help them do it smoothly and get rich, or get buried with everyone else who stays loyal to a dead man. The fire crackled. Shadows danced across Bumpy's face. His expression revealed nothing. "And what did you tell Solomon?" "I told him I needed time to think." Webb laughed, a sound like gravel grinding against glass. He needed time to think. Hear that, Bumpy? Your boy needed time to think about whether to betray you for $10 million. I say, we end this conversation right now. Bumpy raised one hand. Webb went silent immediately. In this room, that hand was more powerful than any weapon. "How much time did you take, Frank?" 3 days. 3 days! Bumpy let the words hang there. That's a long time to think about betrayal. Frank felt sweat running down his spine despite the cold that seemed to seep through the walls. "I know how it looks." "Tell me how it looks." "It looks like I was considering it. It looks like I was calculating whether your life was worth $10 million. It looks like I got caught and now I'm here trying to save my own skin." Bumpy's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close. "That's exactly how it looks. So convince me otherwise. You've got about 2 minutes before I decide you're not worth the risk." Frank took a breath. In this moment, there was no strategy that could save him. No clever words or manipulations. All he had was the raw truth of who he was and what he'd chosen. I grew up in LaGrange, North Carolina. You know that. What you don't know is what that really meant. My mother picked cotton from the time she was 6 years old until her hands looked like leather and her back couldn't straighten. My father drank himself dead by 40 because he couldn't stand looking at what his life had become. I watched my brothers and sisters grow up knowing they'd never be anything, never have anything, never matter to anyone. He paused, gathering himself. $10 million would change all of that, not just for me, for everyone I love. My mother could rest. My family could have something. I could be somebody instead of just another poor kid from the South who ended up dead or in prison. So you were tempted. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't. For 3 days, I thought about that money constantly. I saw it when I closed my eyes. I imagined what my life would look like. I ran the numbers. I made plans. I let myself believe it was possible. Webb's voice came from behind, dripping contempt. So he admits it. He was ready to sell you out. Let him finish. Frank turned slightly, just enough to look at Bumpy directly. On the third night, I stopped thinking about the money. I started thinking about what happens after. I take Solomon's deal. I hand over everything you've built. I watch the Italians take back what you spent 40 years winning. I get my 10 million. And then what? Then you're rich. Then I'm rich, and I'm also something else. I'm a rat. A traitor. The man who sold out Bumpy Johnson for a pile of cash. I'm the guy who can be bought. The guy whose loyalty has a price tag. And here's what I realized, Bumpy. Once you're that guy forever. Everyone knows it. Everyone remembers it. And everyone knows that if you'll betray someone once for the right number, you'll do it again. Frank's voice hardened. I came from nothing, less than nothing. The only thing I own that nobody can take from me is who I am. My word. My character. The choices I make when nobody's watching. If I take that money, I lose all of it. I become something I can't recognize. Something my mother would be ashamed of. Something I'd have to see in the mirror every morning for the rest of my life. He paused. Let the silence settle. So I'm not here because I got caught. I'm here because I made a choice. I chose to come tell you myself before anyone else could. I chose to face whatever happens next instead of running. I chose loyalty over money. And I wanted you to know that from my own mouth, not from some informant who twisted the story. The room was absolutely still. Even Webb had stopped moving. Bumpy stared at Frank for what felt like hours. His face remained unreadable, a mask of patience and calculation that had kept him alive through decades of gang wars and assassination attempts and federal investigations. Then something shifted. The tension in the room changed texture. Bumpy's shoulders dropped slightly, and something that looked almost like satisfaction flickered across his features. Marcus. Put the gun away. Webb hesitated. Bumpy, I really think, put it away and go wait outside. I need to talk to Frank alone. Webb stared at Bumpy's back for a long moment. Loyalty warred with instinct across his face. Then he holstered the weapon and walked out, closing the door harder than necessary. Bumpy stood slowly, the movement costing him visible effort. The cancer was winning, and both men knew it. He walked to a cabinet against the wall and poured 2 glasses of scotch from a bottle that probably cost more than Frank's monthly rent. He handed one to Frank, who took it with hands that had finally stopped trembling. Sit down, Frank. We need to talk about some things. Frank sat. His legs felt weak, unstable. 5 minutes ago, he'd been certain he was about to die. Now, Bumpy was pouring him expensive scotch and inviting conversation. There was no Solomon, Bumpy said. The words didn't compute. Frank stared at him, waiting for clarification. The man who approached you, the warehouse, the money, the whole thing. I arranged it. Solomon's real name is Vernon. He's worked for me for 23 years. Good man, excellent actor. Frank's mind struggled to process what he was hearing. It was a test. It was the only test that matters. I've been running it for 2 months now. You're the 12th person I've tested. Bumpy lowered himself back into his chair with a grimace of pain he didn't bother hiding. 12 men. Men I've trusted for years. Men who swore they'd die before betraying me. Men who took oaths of loyalty that they claimed were sacred. You know how many of them passed? Frank shook his head. None. Not a single one. Every single man I tested took the deal. Some of them didn't even pretend to hesitate. They saw $10 million and forgot everything. Forgot who made them. Forgot who protected them. Forgot what loyalty means. They folded like paper, Frank. Men I would have died for sold me out for money. Bumpy's voice carried a weight of disappointment so heavy it bent the air around it. I'm dying. You probably already know that. The doctors say a year, maybe less. I've spent the past several months trying to answer the only question that matters anymore. Not how to beat the cancer. I can't beat it. The question is who I can trust with what I've built. Who won't sell Harlem back to the Italians the moment I'm in the ground? Who can carry what I've created into the future? He looked at Frank with something that might have been hope. Now I know it's you. Frank sat frozen. He'd walked into this room expecting execution. Instead, he was being handed a kingdom. Why me? The words came out hoarse. I've only been with you 5 years. I'm your driver, Bumpy. I run errands. I'm nobody. You're nobody who turned down $10 million when nobody was watching. You're nobody who came here to tell me the truth instead of taking the money and disappearing. You're nobody who understands that character can't be purchased. Bumpy leaned forward. The men who've been with me for decades, they've become soft, entitled. They think showing up for 20 years means they deserve to inherit what I built. But entitlement is poison. It makes men weak, predictable. The Italians know exactly how to handle entitled men. Wave enough money, and they forget everything. He pointed at Frank. You still remember what it means to have nothing. You're still hungry. And more importantly, you have something that can't be bought at any price. Real loyalty. The kind that doesn't evaporate when temptation arrives. That's rarer than you know, Frank. Rarer than diamonds. Rarer than anything. Bumpy reached into his desk and pulled out a thick folder. Yellowed documents, photographs, handwritten notes. This is everything. Every business I own. Every property. Every bank account. Every connection I've made in 40 years. Political protection, law enforcement, relationships, supply networks, distribution channels. 40 years of building an empire. I'm giving it all to you. Frank stared at the folder like it might explode. There's more. Bumpy pulled out a smaller piece of paper. An address. A name. There's a man in Bangkok. Sergeant named Ike Atkinson. Military man running a small operation. Heroin from Southeast Asia. Brought back through Army channels. Nobody searches military cargo. Nobody questions soldiers returning from Vietnam. Nobody opens caskets draped in American flags. His eyes gleamed with something that looked like vision. The Italians control the heroin trade because they control the French connection. Their product is garbage. Cut so many times it's barely functional. But the product in Southeast Asia is pure. 98%. You could cut it 20 times and it would still be stronger than anything the Italians sell. If you can get that product directly and bring it here without going through them, you'll own the market. You'll be making more in a week than I made in a year. Frank studied the address. His mind was already working through logistics, possibilities. One more thing. Bumpy's voice dropped. Nicky Barnes. The name hung in the air like smoke. He's going to be a problem. He thinks he's entitled to everything I've built. Thinks because I've groomed him for years, the crown automatically passes to him. He's already made deals with the Italians. Already promised to bring Harlem back under their control. Bumpy paused, and he's been talking to the FBI for 3 years. They turned him in, 64, threatened him with serious time. He folded and started feeding them information. That's why he's never been arrested. That's why he walks around untouchable. He handed Frank a small brass key, worn and heavy with significance. Safe deposit box, Harlem Savings Bank. Inside you'll find everything. Photographs of Nicky meeting with his federal handlers. Recordings, payment records, enough to destroy him completely. When he makes his move against you, and he will make that move, you use this. You release it and watch his entire world collapse. Frank felt the weight of the key in his palm. Such a small object. Such enormous power. Promise me something. Bumpy's voice cracked for the first time. The voice of a dying man who needed to believe his legacy would survive. Promise me you'll build something bigger than I ever could. Promise me you'll keep Harlem in black hands. Promise me that when I'm gone, when everyone comes for what we built, you'll be the one left standing. Frank looked at the folder, the address, the key, the inheritance of a king offered by a dying man to someone he barely knew but trusted completely because of a single choice made in a moment of temptation. I promise. 8 months later, Bumpy Johnson collapsed at his favorite restaurant. Heart attack. The cancer had finally won. He died with his favorite meal in front of him, peaceful at last. Frank got the call 15 minutes later. He allowed himself exactly 1 hour of grief. Then he got dressed in his finest suit and went to war. The funeral drew thousands. Politicians, gangsters, celebrities, civil rights leaders. Everyone who mattered in Black America came to pay respects to the king. Frank arrived late. Deliberately. He walked down the center aisle carrying a briefcase while 2,000 pairs of eyes followed him. Past Nicky Barnes sitting near the front with that confident smirk. Past the Italian representatives who'd come to calculate how quickly they could reclaim Harlem. Frank stopped at the open casket, said a silent prayer, made a silent promise. Then he opened the briefcase and began placing money around Bumpy's body. Stack after stack. Every dollar he'd saved in 5 years. His entire net worth, buried with a king-like tribute to a pharaoh. The church went silent. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. Frank turned and faced the congregation. Some of you think you know what happens next. Some of you have already made deals with outsiders. Already promised to sell what generations built. You know who you are. His eyes found Nicky Barnes. You're all wrong. Bumpy didn't leave this to be divided. He left it to me. And I'm telling you right now that Harlem belongs to Harlem. Anyone who disagrees can come see me directly. He walked out without looking back. And everyone who witnessed that moment understood. They'd just watched the coronation of a new king. Within a year, Frank had established the pipeline from Southeast Asia. Blue magic, he called it. Product so pure it made the Italian supply look like aspirin. He sold it cheaper and made 10 times the profit. Within 3 years, he was earning $1 million daily. Nicky Barnes made his move, exactly as Bumpy predicted. Allied with the Italians, tried to take what Frank had built, and Frank used the key, released every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence proving Nicky was a federal informant. The streets did the rest. The Italians put a contract on Nicky's head. His own people turned against him. He was arrested in 1978, sentenced to life. When other inmates discovered what he was, his existence became a living nightmare. He died decades later under a different name, alone, forgotten, hiding. Frank eventually fell too. Everyone does. The DEA caught up with him in 1975, but even then, facing 70 years, he remembered Bumpy's lessons. He cooperated strategically, gave the feds enough to reduce his sentence while protecting what mattered. Served 7 years instead of 70. He got out, got back in the game, got caught again, got out again, spent his final years as a legend. A movie made about his life, his story told around the world. He died in 2019, 88 years old, surrounded by family. But none of it would have happened without that single night in 1967. That moment when $10 million sat in front of him and he chose to walk away. That test, designed by a dying king to find someone whose loyalty couldn't be purchased. 11 men failed that test. 11 men who'd known Bumpy for decades, who'd sworn oaths they claimed were sacred. They saw the money and forgot everything. Frank remembered. Frank chose differently, and that choice made him immortal. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is walk away from the money. Sometimes integrity pays dividends that dollars never could. Sometimes the choice that looks foolish in the moment is the choice that echoes through history. Bumpy Johnson spent his final months searching for someone who understood that truth, someone who couldn't be bought, someone whose character held firm when temptation arrived. Determines everything you'll become. What would you have chosen? Tell me in the comments. Frank Lucas was making $1 million a day. Not a week, not a month, a day. He owned properties across New York and New Jersey, more than 100 buildings. He had a mansion in Teaneck that looked like it belonged to a movie star. He had cops, judges, prosecutors, politicians on his payroll. He had an army of soldiers loyal only to him. He had everything Bumpy had promised him and more. He had kept his promise. He had built something bigger than Bumpy ever dreamed. But Frank made a mistake. The same mistake every king eventually makes. He got comfortable, confident, visible. When you're on top, you start believing you'll always be on top. March 8th, 1971. The Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier fight. The fight of the century. 15 rounds between the two greatest heavyweight boxers who ever lived. Everyone who was anyone was there, including Frank Lucas, wearing a chinchilla coat and hat worth $50,000. Sitting ringside, better seats than the Italian bosses. Better seats than the corporate executives, right there where everyone could see him. A detective named Richie Roberts was working security that night. He saw Frank, saw the coat, saw the seats, asked himself a question that would change everything. Who is that guy? And how does he have better seats than Carlo Gambino? Roberts started investigating. He found Frank Lucas, a poor kid from North Carolina who understood that some things matter more than money, and that understanding made all the difference. If this story showed you why character outlasts cash and loyalty outlives wealth, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember that who you are when nobody's watching.